I will do my best to tell you a little bit of a story about the people that made Marshfield what it is, and as the description said, people, places, and things that are important to Marshfield. When I was asked to do this, I wasn't quite sure how I was going to set it up. So I ended up being asked a question a couple weeks ago because Marshfield's celebrating their 150th anniversary, and someone said, can you list the top 10 events in Marshfield's history for the last 50 years? And that's a tough one to kind of pick out just 10 things in 50 years. And then when he sent me a response or a reminder that he was still waiting for a response, he changed it to the past 150 years. And I thought, well, 150 years is much easier, and it kind of gives us a chance to tell the story of Marshfield's history by those major events. And so that's what we're going to try to do, is kind of hit these 10 events and talk about Marshfield's history. If you think about Marshfield just coming into existence, it would have never happened if it hadn't been for the railroad. When you look at the development of the state of Wisconsin, cities and towns developed along waterways. So Green Bay, Milwaukee, Wisconsin Rapids, Wausau, all had an earlier start than the city of Marshfield. What we had to wait for Marshfield was the railroad to come through. And in 1871, shortly after the Civil War, the federal government wanted to build an easy access to the Canadian border, because during the Civil War, the Canadians had been sympathizers toward the South. And there was a slight fear that something might happen, and they wanted to be able to move troops to the northern borders if they had to. So they started to plan this railroad, and in 1871 they were building the railroad from, actually they were building it from Neenah Menasha over to Stevens Point, and then from Stevens Point up to Ashland. And in Marshfield's situation, it just happened to come right through our area, and that area had a good stand of pine. And eventually, because of the pine attracted people interested in logging or tapping those timber supplies that are there. And so what was known as Section 32, because we're 32 miles from Stevens Point, and the railroad was being built in 1871 from Stevens Point toward Ashland, we're Section 32 because we're 32 miles away. So when they were first reporting the construction of the railroad, the opening of the land, the laying of the tracks and things, they would refer to, they're at Section 25, they're at Section 32 and stuff. Marshfield didn't get named Marshfield for a couple of years. Anticipating the railroad brought a guy from Necedah. His name was Louis Rivers. And there's different stories about how and why he came to this area to be there. But basically it was the idea of he was going to be there to supply the railroad crews, either supplies or lodging. Some places when you read the history it says that he purchased the land, other places it says he was given the land. Some places credit it to the railroad inviting him, some credit it to the guy who owned the property inviting him. Either way, in 1871, he was probably in the area. Tradition has it in Marshfield it was April 1st, 1872, but the railroad crews were going through and clearing the land already in 1871. And I think if you're going to try to capitalize on customers, and you want to be the only one providing those services, he was probably here in 1871. The history of northern Wisconsin documents the day as 1871, but in Marshfield, we typically have celebrated the anniversary on the 100th anniversary was in 1972, the 125th was in 1997, and so this year, the 150th will be celebrated in 2022. Tradition, you don't change or try to go against the legend. So anyway, when Rivers arrived in Marshfield in April 1st, 1872, the story goes that he came with his wife and a daughter, Della, and his brother, Frank, and then he was an employer at a large hotel in Necedah, and he brought one of his employees, Gabriel Adolph Lupien, who came to be known as Dolph, and actually lived in Marshfield most of his life. When it comes to the Rivers family, Frank left town in the 1890s. Louis kind of walked away from town in the 1880s. His wife, Mina, divorced him, and his daughter, Della, died very young. So there's no direct relatives to this family in Marshfield today. There may be some shirt-tail relatives, but not descendants of his. When it comes to the train also has a legend that it was arrived in Marshfield on July 4th, 1872. And one of the things that's unique about Marshfield, and when you think about researching the history of different places and times, newspapers are a really important key thing to look at. For Marshfield, the problem was that we didn't have a paper in 1872, so we couldn't document everything that happened in 1872 until about 1880. The newspaper actually started being published in Marshfield in 1879, but the first couple of years are missing, so the earliest dates that we can really research Marshfield history is in 1882. And there's a lot of things that happened between 1872 and 1882 that are just lost because they weren't recorded. And I'm a preacher about newspapers. The newspapers were really important to documenting the history of communities. When we do history, it's easy to go back and look at past issues. Future generations, when they go to look at things for us, they're going to have a hard time finding the history that we take for granted because it was documented in the newspapers. There are things in the newspapers that you don't think should have ever been put there and probably wouldn't be put there today, but they're important resources for us to use. So anyway, when it came to Louis Rivers, the idea is that the railroad arrived in 1872, and we won't argue about the date. We're not sure if it's exactly right, but we won't argue about it. That's the tradition. The other tradition is that in 1872, when he arrived in Marshfield, the first thing he did was fall a tree to start building a log cabin. And this is a postcard that was shared during the 1930s as Louis Rivers' first log hotel. And it served as a church, the restaurant, a store, a post office, a saloon, and a school building. And when you look at that particular building, if off on the right-hand side, you see a little attached building. Didn't take long after he got there that he needed to kind of add additional space. But it had multiple purposes, and it existed for a few years until he could put up a new building. And I'll show you a sketch of his new building in a couple of minutes. But this is an important first for Marshfield. This is the first settlement in town, and again, it dates back to 1872. Now, the question comes up is, how did Marshfield get its name? People ask that question almost every time I give a tour at the Historical Society. Say, well, how did Marshfield get its name? The first time you see the term Marshfield used to define the area has to do with Louis Rivers' application for postmaster. And in that, it specifically specifies that the township would be known as Marshfield, and that's how we have a town of Marshfield next to or containing the city of Marshfield. What I think is interesting about this is when they fill in, there's a couple things. When they filled in this application, they wanted to know the location of the nearest post offices. And if you look going north along the Wisconsin Central Railroad, the first post office was in Unity. If you went back to the east, the first one was in Stevens Point. And if you went west and south a little bit, there was another one located in Nasonville. Now, Nasonville was located on a stagecoach road. It wasn't on a railroad. But the other two were connected to the same railroad. And you can see that it's quite a distance between Marshfield and Stevens Point and Marshfield and Unity as far as post office delivery. A couple questions on here that I think were, well, two things that I want to point out yet that I think are interesting is when this was sent in, they described the population in 1873 as being at 300. And that's describing the entire township was 300 people. And then there's a signature on it. And what's interesting is Louis Rivers was not able to read or write. So I'm not sure who signed the paper and who divided the mail, but it wasn't Louis Rivers. Before he died, he did learn to write, but at this particular time, everything else is signed with an X. Well, it was one of those deals. He probably had it, well, not probably. It says that his brother Frank actually did the mail stuff, but he got paid for it. So, oops. Second thing, or the second time we see the name of Marshfield listed, has to do with the platting of the city. The city, or the village, I'm sorry. In 1875, a man came from Massachusetts who actually owned the majority of the property in the central Wisconsin area. He and his sisters actually inherited it from their uncle. But in 1875, they came to town, and town was such that he didn't even, I don't know if he came to town and left, but when he wanted to meet with Mr. Rivers to establish the city plat, they met in Neilsville to do the discussion. Marshfield was not a very hospitable place in the early days of Marshfield. And so there was no place that Mr. Marsh felt comfortable in, so they met in Neilsville in a hotel. And the original plat is actually recorded first in Massachusetts, then sent to Wood County to be recorded there. And it was done in the Wood County Register of Deeds office, September 9th, 1875. There's a couple things on this plat map that I think are important because it talks about the foresight of Mr. Marsh when it came to designing or developing a city. Central Avenue was designed at being 100 feet wide. One of Marshfield's pride and joys is its really wide Central Avenue. People say that it was widened after the fire of 1877, and that's not true. It was really developed as a 100-foot wide Central Avenue right from the start. The other thing that's interesting is that Mr. Marsh wanted dedicated public park space. And so if you look in on the plat map here, you can see a park here and another one up here. The first space, Lot O, never really was developed into a public park. But our first park in Marshfield is the Columbia Park space, and it was a park on the plat in 1875, and today it's the oldest park in Marshfield, and it's where we hold our band concert. It's a city block of just nice green space with a sidewalk that goes through it and a band shelter. And for more than 100, probably close to 120 years, it's been used for weekly concerts of our Marshfield Civic Band. In 1883, the city would come back and go to the state and petition the state to become an official city. And that was done also in April. April 2nd or 3rd of 1883, we were granted an ordinance to become a city. And we'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. The individuals who I keep mentioning here, and I want to show you their pictures, are Samuel Marsh on the left and John Marsh next to him. Samuel Marsh was a prominent businessman from Massachusetts and New York. He was an investor in the Foxwood and Wisconsin River Improvement Company, and he was also the president of the New York and Erie Railroad. He was a wealthy man. And when he passed away, the year that Marshfield was founded, he left everything to his nieces and nephews. John Marsh tends to be the name that's mentioned most frequently in the Marshfield papers, but his sister, Elizabeth Ames, Kelly, they're also listed and also have property in Marshfield. I think because he was a lawyer, he represented his brothers and sisters, and you see his name mentioned more frequently in the Marshfield reports. Now, one of the things about Mr. Marsh that's known from out in Massachusetts is that he was wealthy and very philanthropic. He donated money to the universities, things that were important in Massachusetts, he had his hand in contributing to them. And in Marshfield, there's a story that when Marshfield tried to develop a library, he donated the first 500 books. And the story goes that he contributed them to the city of Marshfield, basically in honor of the fact that the town was named after his uncle, Samuel Marsh. And he made one provision in that donation was that his friend, William Upham, would head the committee to handle the library affairs. Now, Mr. Upham, we're going to talk about in a second. He was very important to the history of Marshfield, but he was a very busy man, and when it came to actually caring for those library books, that responsibility passed to his wife. And his wife and the members of the the Women's Christian Temperance Union actually took charge of the Marshfield Municipal Library based on those book donations. Now, we're still trying to get to the point about how Marshfield got its name. And the answer here is going to be depending on who you talk to, because that's just the way a history is. Everybody gets their own opinion about what it is. So the first question, was it named after Samuel Marsh? According to John Marsh and Mr. Upham, it was named by John Marsh in honor of his uncle Samuel. And in this book written in 1908, Mr. Upham is quoted as saying that that's how that naming came about. At the same time, he said that there's a legend going around now that it was named after Marshfield, Massachusetts. If you talk to people who are heavily involved with the railroad, they will tell you that many of the towns along the Wisconsin Central Railroad have Massachusetts names. And so why should Marshfield be any different? It was named after Marshfield, Massachusetts. Here's the contradiction to that. And then if you go back and look at the Essex County history, there's a line in the history of Essex County talking about Samuel Marsh, talking that Marshfield, now a thriving town in Wood County, Wisconsin, preserves the name and marks the foresight of Samuel Marsh. So really when it comes to the name, there's different arguments, and it depends on who you're talking to as far as what might be accepted. But Marshfield seems to have gotten its name from Samuel Marsh, probably named by his uncle or by his nephew, because Samuel was gone already. He passed away before Marshfield was formed, and because he and Mr. Upham must have done business, and Mr. Upham, I will talk about in a minute, acquired large parcels of land from him, so they were relatively close business associates. Now, the third thing that has to do with Marshfield's history that's important is W.H. Upham arriving in town. And everybody in Marshfield knows the story about William Upham, and I don't know that everybody here knows how important he was to the area, but he was a very important man to the history of Marshfield, and he has a wonderful story, and there's just not time to tell the entire story today. So I would encourage you to stop in Marshfield sometime, visit the Historical Society or the Heritage Museum, and we'll be glad to fill you in on the rest of the story. But William Upham came to Marshfield in 1878, and he didn't travel by himself. When he arrived in Marshfield, he came with nephews, with cousins, and so there was kind of an influx right away of the population of Marshfield just based on the Upham family coming to Marshfield. And when they arrived, the first thing he did was start setting up businesses. His first business was a sawmill built in 1878. At the same time he was building the sawmill, he put up a mercantile store on Central Avenue. That also would house their home. They spent the first 2 years living in the upstairs of that particular building. When they first arrived in Marshfield, Marshfield still was to a point that it wasn't socially the place to be for some people. And Mr. Upham's wife and probably his sister or his sister-in-law actually stayed in Manville until the mercantile store was finished being built, and then they moved back from Manville to Marshfield. But Marshfield is a town that still exists. Manville is a town that's about 6 miles north of Marshfield that no longer exists. And it has to do with the character of the people that are really the major employers. And we'll talk about the Marshfield fire. The character of Mr. Upham in the Marshfield fire was really important. Anyway, over the next couple of years, he continues to add on. 1879, he had the planing mill. 1882, a furniture factory, a grist mill, and we'll go through a list of some of the other things. But the important thing, when he first arrived in Marshfield, he had the capacity to produce 6 to 7 million board feet of pine a year. And he had purchased between 7 miles east of Marshfield and 15 miles south. So you take that down to the Yellow River, down by Pittsville and things, and that was all timberland that he had bought. So he had a good supply of standing timber to cut for making logs and then cutting lumber. This is the family members, Will and Mary. They actually both grew up in Racine, Wisconsin. Neither one of them was born in Racine. Mary was born in Cleveland, Ohio, and William Upham was born in Westminster, Massachusetts. As children, they made their way to Racine. They were married in December of 1867, and shortly, well, at the time he was in the military. He would be in the military for a couple of years, and then he resigned his commission and came back to Wisconsin. And they moved to Kewanee first. They had 2 adopted daughters. His cousin, Caroline, gave birth and passed away shortly thereafter. And he and Mary adopted the younger daughter, Caroline. And then a couple years later, the older daughter, Elsie, came. So he actually raised his cousin's 2 kids as his own children. And when he died, a friend of his, Charles King, wrote a story about, or a tribute about Mr. Upham, when he talked about the nickname that he had for his wife. And he referred to his wife as his devoted chum and his comrade. And so this is a very close relationship when it comes to the history of the town. And Mr. Upham is important to Marshfield, but Mrs. Upham is equally important to Marshfield. He took care of business aspects of it. She took care of social aspects of it. And they were both very important. In town, the nickname for Mrs. Upham with the townspeople was Aunt Mary. You don't give that title to someone unless you have some pretty strong affection for them. This is a picture of the second wife. I probably should tell you that, okay, after 45 years of marriage, Mary Upham died in 1912. And Mr. Upham was beside himself. And people in town told him to build a boat because he liked to sail and go sailing. And so in the summer of 1913, he had a yacht built up in De Pere, Wisconsin. And I think this is so funny for people that are familiar with Marshfield. There's no place to sail a 55-foot yacht. But he had a 55-foot yacht built, and then in November of 1913, he took that boat down the Lake Michigan to the canals in Chicago and took the canals out to the Mississippi River and then sailed down the Mississippi River to the Gulf of Mexico and spent the winter months tooling around the Gulf of Mexico. While he's down there, his younger daughter, Caroline, was married to Senator Sawyer's son by that time, and they wintered in Florida. So he was going down there to visit family. But he's also down there, and as he's starting to go back home, he's pulling into different ports along the eastern seashore. A storm came up outside of Beaufort, North Carolina, and he ended up spending a little bit more time in Beaufort, North Carolina than he planned. And while he's there, he meets Grace Mason. And Grace, if you look at her birth dates, was born in 1887, and she died in 1975. So she was much younger than Mr. Upham. There were 46 years difference in their age, and they got married in 1915. And so in 1915, when they got married, they came back to Marshfield. He had the house all kind of redone for her so that it was her house rather than his and Mary's house. And then they had 2 children. They had young Bill, William H. Upham II, or Jr., who lived from 1916 to 2009, and then Fritz, or Frederick, who was born in 1921 and just passed away a couple years ago in 2019. Now, one of the things about this man and the story that goes with him, he was a Civil War soldier. He was born in 1841. He was 20 years old at the start of the Civil War, went to the Civil War, and he shot in the chest at the First Battle of Bull Run and left for dead on the battlefield. His funeral's commemorated back in Racine, Wisconsin, where he's living, and then they find out he was taken prisoner instead of dying. So he spends 6 months in Libby prison, and when he gets out of Libby prison, he's transferred from Libby prison in a prisoner of war exchange to Washington, D.C. He's going to be discharged because of his wounds, and the senator from Wisconsin at the time was somebody who knew Upham. He was Senator Doolittle from Racine, and he invited him to meet President Lincoln. So he had a chance to meet President Lincoln when he's 20 years old. And then he goes, after he's done talking to Mr. Lincoln says, supposedly, is there anything I can do for you? And this 20-year-old kid said, I would like to be appointed to West Point. And so he's the first non-commissioned soldier, private in the service, to be appointed to West Point by the president. He has a chance to meet President Lincoln again when he goes to West Point at the fall of 1862. Then he graduates in 1866, and he has a chance to meet, well, he's actually not a chance, he's put in charge of the guard duty, the night guard for Jefferson Davis, who's being held prisoner at Fort Monroe, Virginia. So, interesting stories on this guy. This is what Marshfield looked like when he was in town. And remember, we said that in 1873, the population of the entire township was 300 people. I know this is a difficult map to see in great detail, but this is actually Marshfield's business district running through here. And if you look, this is Central Avenue. This is the Wisconsin Central Railroad running through here. So it kind of forms across and runs through on a diagonal there. And we'll do a close-up of things, but that's what Marshfield looked like within 10 years. And if the population was estimated in 1878 at being 450 for the township, you can see there's tremendous growth that's occurring after Mr. Upham arrives in Marshfield. When it comes to his business corporations or business holdings in town by 1883, you can see that he owned a wide swath of property. And what you see here with these buildings, down here where you look at the building that says 1, you'll see the logs floating down where it says South First Street. That's the mill pond. Then his sawmill. Then his planing mill is labeled number 2. And his home was built in 1880, is listed as number 3. So he had quite a nice piece of property located in what today is kind of the heart of the city, that he was developing as his business holdings. And the reason I wanted to bring this out was with this particular thing was that Mr. Upham was fairly well respected by his employees. And in 1882, July 1st, 1882, the employees thought to give him an American flag, probably related to the 4th of July. And so this article talks about the fact that he's being presented with this embroidered American flag they don't come right out and say that it's a post flag, but I suspect that it was a post-size flag. And a post flag is like what you see flying at Perkins. They have those really tall flag poles with the large flag on it. That's the post flag. If you were going on a military base, you'd see that in front of the headquarters. But that was given to Mr. Upham. And then there was a little presentation by some of his employees, and then it talks, the newspaper reporter captures the fact that Mr. Upham got all choked up, and he stumbled on his own words because it was kind of it was a very touching scene for him to be thought that highly of by his employees. And I think that flag is really important because you know it meant something to him when he received it, but it also comes into play a little later on when Marshfield burns. And just to give you a kind of an impression here, this is the Upham home, and across the street from the Upham home was the Upham office building, and he had a flagpole erected there. And if you look at this is the flagpole. And these pictures are usually sketched very accurately as far as scale. And so you can see that was a large post-sized flag that probably would have been sailing on that flagpole then. This is Walnut, and Walnut is 2 blocks off of Central, and Central runs parallel. So we've got Walnut Street running here, Chestnut Street there, and Central Avenue would have been cut off of the picture just under there. The Upham house is 2 blocks off. The address is 212 West 3rd Street. And so it's just 2 blocks off of Central, or not quite 3 blocks. So the next thing that was important in Marshfield's history, and we're going to talk about Mr. Upham back and forth here some more, is that Marshfield had a problem with, in every small town, a logging community had problems with fires. But in the case of Marshfield, a series of small fires actually prompted some big things to happen. In January of 1883, Louis Rivers had a large 3-story hotel that he had built a couple years earlier, and this is actually it. Oops, wrong one. It here, you can see the 3-story hotel. It was built in 1880, and in the winter of 1883, it started on fire. And it was a slow-burning fire. What ended up happening, there was a defect in the chimney, and when the fire started, they would have been able to put it out because it was going real slow, but they didn't have any water. At the time, it was 26 below zero, so they watched that building burn as they carried all the things out of it, but there was no way of putting it out because the fire, the extinguishing ability with the water wasn't available to them. And so over the course of the day, that building burned to the ground and it was gone. It was only 3 years old. But what's important about that with Marshfield is that it was one of the things that triggered the move to go out and ask the state legislature for incorporation as a city so they could assess taxes and raise funds to start a fire department. And so that was one little episode with the fire. Actually, before the Frenchtown fire, the city actually had been approved. The 2nd or 3rd of April, the state legislature had approved the city becoming a city. And the second fire that happened here was the Frenchtown fire. And Frenchtown is actually on First Street, just south of the railroads. You don't hear it referred to often as Frenchtown, but when it burnt, then they were talking about it being Frenchtown. And there were a couple of individuals with French names, and so it probably had to do with the residents of that particular piece of property. But in April of 1883, a couple buildings in here started on fire and started to spread. It actually was put out before it hit Central Avenue, but the argument was that if it had hit Central Avenue, they wouldn't have been able to stop it. And so that's kind of one of the reasons that they wanted to start or create a waterworks park. And this is where Mr. Upham comes in again. Upham was someone who approached city issues thinking about what was good for the city more than what was good for him. And in 1883, he was on the city council. He had proposed putting in a waterworks plant so that he could provide or lay pipes to Central Avenue and have fire hydrants on Central Avenue. The council wouldn't approve it. And so finally, after these fires, he went ahead and said that he was going to put it in. And if it worked, great. And if it didn't, the city would be out no money. So in June of 1883, these were finished. The pipes were laid, the fire hydrants were in, and they were going to do a test. When they tested the water to see if it worked, they turned on the water, turned on the hose, and the water dribbled out, and so he was really disappointed. But they went back and looked, and there was a connection that wasn't tight, so they tightened it up and redid it again, and all at once they had a 132-foot spray of water coming out of this hydrant downtown, and they were convinced that they had prevented or they had a solution to any potential fire in the future. So that year saw the next couple of years saw a couple other fires. The first one, the Upham Sawmill in 1884, even though they had the fire hoses and equipment, they couldn't put out the fire. Then the planing mill started on fire in 1885. They were able to extinguish it with the hose and the water, and the same thing with the John Stilp barn. And since they now felt pretty confident they had a system in place that worked, they went on to talk about other things. And for Upham, first one of those, and this is going to interrupt the chronology here about water and light, but this happened in the middle, so I thought I'd leave it right here, is that Upham decided to build a flour mill, a grain mill. And his argument was that the farmers that were in the area needed a place to take their grains to market. And so he put this up, and it had a capacity to do 25,000 barrels of flour, and I can't remember the time for it, it was a month or whatever, but it had potential, a large potential for making flour available. So he gave that to the farmers in the area then, but because there was this grain or this capacity to produce flour, it gave an enticement to others to come to Marshfield. And what they talk about was Upham's foresight in recognizing that the timber supply was not going to last forever. He was already thinking that the logs, the standing timber and then the logs was going to run out, and there would have to be another source of revenue for the people in town. And this is the first symbol of that going to some other economy than wood products. And then back to the power company, 2 years later, this was in 1885, 1 year later, or at the same time actually, shortly after, he was working on establishing a power plant. And now he had a power plant for his mill, and he had 5 generators, different generators for different purposes. But in 1885, he wanted to provide light to the sawmill, to the engine room, the grist mill, the Upham store, and then the Tremont Hotel, or the Tremont House was a big hotel on Central Avenue. They wanted lights, and then the city streets were given lights. And so in December of 1885, his nephew's wife flipped the switch and turned on lights for the first time in the city of Marshfield. Now, Marshfield has the reputation or the record for being the first municipality in Wisconsin to have steam-generated power. Appleton has the first hydroelectric power, but Marshfield had the first steam electric power. So we beat Wausau as far as having lights. We beat Milwaukee as far as having lights. And it's again because of the foresight of somebody like Mr. Upham that happened. Seventh thing is the Reconstruction after the Marshfield fire. And one of the things that I think is important, the Marshfield fire was important to the history of Marshfield, but it wasn't the fire that was important, it was what we did after the fire. And what we did after the fire was, this is the fire area, and this is Central Avenue running here, and at the end of the day, the fire starts over here in the Upham Mill. By the end of the day, 12 city blocks are basically gone. Every house is gone on that stretch. All the stores in town are gone but one. The corner of Arnold Street and Central, there was a store called the Steinmetz store, and that store survived the fire. But otherwise, everything was gone. This is a picture of, I think this is a picture, yeah. This is a picture taken a couple days after the Marshfield fire, and it shows you what was left. And so if you think about a town that has a population of about less than 4,000 people at the time, but more than 3,000, this is what was left to them that morning after the fire. And what's cool about this story and why the Reconstruction is important is because the city could have just gone ahead and rebuilt with wood, but they didn't. The story goes that the first thing that people asked is, are you going to rebuild? They went to Mr. Upham and said, are you going to rebuild the company? And that's because he was the major employer at the time. He didn't know. He basically said, I must think this through. This is the way the newspaper account goes. And then he says that if I raise my flag in the next morning, then that signifies that I will rebuild. And people went to bed that night not knowing for sure whether or not he would rebuild or not. The next morning, the story goes, at 6 a.m., he went outside with one of his aides, and he stood at attention below that flag and told his aide, who was Hans Billy, to raise the flag, signifying that he would rebuild. And because he was willing to rebuild, everybody else was willing to rebuild. And he made a couple promises. He said, I will have my complete operation up in 90 days. And then he said, no one will be out of work while we're rebuilding. And so as the major employer for Marshfield, he made sure things that were going to happen. The second thing that they did underneath that flagpole that day was they had a common council meeting where they decided that it would be permissible to build buildings temporarily out of wood, but all the buildings within the fire district had to be built of brick. And so if you look at Marshfield's history books and things, you'll see pictures like this where you'll see a small wooden frame structure sandwiched between 2 brick buildings going up. And it was up and down Central Avenue that they had these temporary shacks that they used for either office buildings or stores, lawyers' offices, whatever. That's where they were while their stores were being built. And it's kind of fun when you look at these pictures, you can see that the windows haven't been put in yet, or you'll see the walls in various stages of construction. And then again, he promised that all of his employees would have employment, and the first thing he did is, we have to clean. So they started cleaning up all the rubbish after the fire. Now, Marshfield developed a reputation following the fire because it came and built back modern buildings. And so this is a picture, actually dates about 1900, but those are the buildings that were being built in 1887 after the fire. Everything was solid brick buildings. It gave it a very modern appearance, and that was one of the reasons that people came back to Marshfield, because it changed the image of the town. It made it look more metropolitan. And so Marshfield became a major shopping center for people in that time frame after the fire.
All those buildings are still there today?
Some are, some are not. It depends. Some have been burnt and some of them have been taken down.
But quite a few are.
Right. In this case, for example, this is looking you're looking north on Central Avenue from the corner of 4th Street to 3rd Street. The 3rd Street side, on the west side of Central Avenue, those buildings were all taken down in 1978 to put up a bank building. So that's the current location of the BMO Bank in Marshfield. The buildings on the other side are all there yet. Some of them were involved in fires over the years, and the front facades have changed because of that. But most of the buildings are still there, but there are some that have been replaced. And we have some people in town doing some wonderful things with renovation now, restoring the fronts of the old buildings that are still there. So, this is Mr. Upham's plant in the fall of 1887. The picture actually appeared in an 1888 newspaper print, but it shows his plant after the fire, that he went back and rebuilt everything, and as he said, in 90 days, and it was either shortly after or on target as far as having everything up and running in 90 days. But you can see the banner mills were reconstructed, the furniture factory was made bigger, the planing mill was over there and moved, the sawmill was back up, he had stacks of lumber again. So he was back in business, and he was a very successful businessman, but he had some bad luck over the years because he owned a number of mills that burnt down. And it had lost some other losses too. But this is his plant in, like I said, 1888. After the fire and after the rebuilding, something else was going on that was important, and that was that the city was adding additional railroad lines into town. And so when we think about the history of Marshfield and the decision for Mr. Upham to stay, it probably wasn't just on the fact that we had the railroad line coming through in the 1870 Wisconsin Central coming through, or the fact that he was building a railroad line south of town, but there were multiple other lines coming through town. Marshfield became known as the hub of Wisconsin after the 1890s because of the number of railroad tracks that came to Marshfield. You had lines from Wausau, you had lines from Wisconsin Rapids over to Neillsville, over to Greenwood, connecting to Minneapolis, St. Paul, and connecting to Chicago. It put Marshfield in a really good position for negotiating prices for shipping. And so the importance of the railroad was that it made Marshfield more attractive to visitors. When it comes to the railroad, a couple things that are important. 1,000 freight cars a day were going through Marshfield. And a lot of our industry at the time settled along the Wisconsin Central Railroad tracks or the Chicago Northwestern tracks because they could ship easily from there. It was also an important route for passenger travel. In 1893, they had 28 passengers arriving daily, 28 passenger trains arriving daily, 1903, 38. But we all know that in the 1930s, 40s, automobiles became more frequently used, and you start to see the diminishing of train traffic. The last passenger trains in Marshfield ran between 1950 and 54, and Marshfield kind of lost its advantage as being a convention center. Marshfield was in the 1910s, 20s, and 30s. Everybody came to Marshfield to have a convention, and that's why we had so many big, fancy hotels up and down Central Avenue and in the area. So we had to be aware that the economy was changing, and Upham did that first with the banner mills. But other people were seeing that there had to be a transition from the products that were being produced with wood. And so that brings up Mr. Axel K. Hattiberg. Axel K. Hattiberg is probably a name that not everyone is familiar with, but he developed a better, more improved mechanism or machine for peeling the wood off of a log to create veneer. And in 1890, Mr. Upham encouraged him, he was one of his employees, to start his own company because he recognized the usefulness of the product. 1897, there's a fire and the entire mill is gone. Now, Mr. Upham, several mills burnt, and the first thing he did was rebuild. But Hattiberg wasn't comfortable rebuilding, reinvesting. And so the company was sold to the Roddice family. And Augusta Roddice used to always tell the story about that William H. Roddice purchased the failing Hattiberg Lumber and Veneer Company. And I don't know that I want to say that it was a failing company, but it wasn't being seen or reaching its full potential. And people like the Roddice family, William H. Roddice and his son Hammy, could see the potential that they could do with the veneers. And so over the next 60 years, Hamilton Roddice and his father actually made that company grow. In 1960, prior to the family selling the business, or Hamilton Roddice selling the business, they were having sales of $59 million a year coming out of the city of Marshfield for wood products. And both of them were visionary as far as this is what we need to do to get to this point. So they are very important people to the history of Marshfield. And yet that's still just wood products. But Marshfield is more than wood products. And so you have to start thinking about, other business products that are involved in a community. And for Marshfield, one of the first things that's important is dairy. Remember, Mr. Upham saw the purpose of having a grain mill. Charles Blodgett came to Marshfield in 1896. First, he buys a hotel, and he's a very successful hotel owner, but he's involved with lots of other things. He's one of these people that have the foresight to see what's possible also. And he was involved with the Blodgett Booth Lumber Company. 1910, he quits that, and he gets involved with a company, he creates a company called the C.E. Blodgett Butter, Cheese, and Egg Company. And he's responsible for shipping more cheese. He becomes almost like the cheese king of Wisconsin because more cheese leaves Marshfield and other dairy products because of Charlie Blodgett. He becomes very wealthy. He invests a lot of things in the community. But before he dies in 1929, he's actually purchased large portions of the downtown because he saw what the potential was for things, and he made things happen. And so in 1926, he wanted to put up a new hotel, and he put up the Hotel Charles. And then a few years later, he expanded the Hotel Charles so that it was extending almost back to the end of the next block. There was a customer, or not a customer, but a owner of the piece of property that held out and wouldn't sell to him, and so the building stops in the middle of about 3/4 of the way down the alley, or 3/4 of the way down 2nd Street. But it's a massive 3-story brick building made with Marshfield brick that still stands today. I was told last week, we were going through that, and the guy said that the state came and inspected it to make sure it would survive an earthquake. And when he left, he said, this building's not going anywhere. So it's one of those buildings that's going to be around for a long time. Today it's an apartment building, and it's fun to go into Victory Apparel's a shop downstairs. It's fun to go in there and look at the woodwork and things in there, and then the lobby is open also. It is a beautiful building, and the current owners are doing a lot to keep it up, so that's important. The other person I wanted to mention, and this is not one that should be a surprise because people think about Marshfield, they think about Figgy cheese. John Figgy was a guy from Marshfield who in 1941 started the Cheese Club of the, or Cheese of the Month Club, a mail order catalog company. And that company survived for about 60 years, and actually about 80 years. He had sold it in between there. But what's important about it is, again, this is an individual with a vision about what he wants to do and willing to take a risk. And I think Marshfield is filled with those people that would make Marshfield better by taking risks themselves. And then, because this is almost a June dairy month, I have to mention some of the agribusinesses. The first one, the Banner Mill, again, that Mr. Upham started in the 1880s, eventually was sold to the Spar family. The Spar family eventually sold it or traded it to Walter Prince Koenig's father, H.C. Koenig. And today that corporation is celebrating its 100th anniversary as the Prince Corporation. And it's still a Marshfield business in place. There are a number of other agribusinesses in Marshfield that are just an example of what people with a vision and a willingness to take a risk and invest time and effort in can do. Nelson Jameson Company is a major supplier of equipment in Marshfield for dairy industry, and the H&S Manufacturing is another one. And then we have farms, beautiful farms throughout the area that took advantage of the farmland, the woodland, after it was cleared to create beautiful farms. And this is Kenny and Karen Seehafer's farm on Highway 97 north of Marshfield. Then the ninth one, and again, this is important, and the two events didn't happen at the same time, but because they're all linked together, I'm going to talk about them together. In 1890, a group of sisters came to Marshfield to establish a hospital. The hospital became known as St. Joseph's Hospital. It celebrated its 125th anniversary in 2015, and since then it's been sold to the Marshfield Clinic as part of the Marshfield Clinic health system. But it was a very important addition to Marshfield because now we're starting to switch to a service industry, and one of the biggest things that Marshfield is known for today, if it's not the biggest, is the medical care that's provided through the Marshfield Clinic health system. When St. Joseph's Hospital started out, it would sell insurance for $5 a ticket, $5 to $10 a ticket to lumbermen. So if something happened to them, they could be admitted to the hospital and they would be taken care of free of charge. And then to attract people, they had what was known as the Knipp Wasser cure. It was an application of cold water or cold water and different holistic type medicine approaches. They did that for the first few years and then discontinued it in 1895 because some of the docs thought they could be doing better care other ways. But it was a legitimate care or treatment plan at that time period. And then for those of us that grew up in Marshfield, we remember looking at the back of a hospital and seeing St. Mary's Convent. It became the headquarters for the Sister of Sorrowful Mother for a number of years, and it wasn't until the 1970s that the convent building came down. The building or the area has changed a lot, but the thing that's a constant is Marshfield has been involved with healthcare since the 1890s. And then we talk about the Marshfield Clinic and their foundation. They celebrated their 100th anniversary in 2016. They were actually started by 6 physicians who were Marshfield physicians. Carl Dagey up on the top is actually the one who had the idea about a joint practice, and he went out and talked to each of the docs that were in Marshfield. There were 10 doctors in town at the time. I don't see it written down, but there were 10 doctors at the time in Marshfield. He talked to them all, invited them all to participate. Dr. Hayward was getting up in years and said he was going to retire. Another one had wanted nothing to do with it, and he packed up and moved out of town. And then a couple continued to practice on their own. But this nucleus of 6 physicians was what established the Marshfield Clinic. They first were in a space above the Thiel building, the corner of 3rd and Central. They were there for about 10 years upstairs. If you weren't in good shape when you got to the top of the hills, you probably didn't need care, or top of the steps, because it was a long, straight, steep stairway. Can't imagine treating patients who were coming in with heart conditions and having them walk up those stairs today. But in 1927, they built a new building on South Central Avenue. It's still there. It's been emptied out, though, and it's a racquetball club. on the inside and attached to the old clinic building. During the 1950s and 1960s, they did lots of extensions or additions to that building. And then in 1978, they knew that they were cramped for space there and they wanted to move someplace where they had more space, so they moved north. And I think that when it came to those top 10 things in the past 50 years, one of the things that I would have put down is the move to the north, because it caused a lot of expansion to businesses in the area on the north side of town. So that was an important thing. Today, I think that statistic of 3,000 is probably low because they've added more hospitals and more things, but I didn't change it. I know that they're supposed to have more than 1,300 physicians alone, and then you have to have the support staff to help the physicians. So I'm sure that number is low compared to what it really is today. But it is still the largest private, not-for-profit specialty group in the United States. Oops. Then the last thing that I wanted to mention was street paving. And we have these beautiful brick buildings on Central Avenue, and in 1915, we still had a dirt road. And if it rained, it was muddy. Women would have planks put down across the Central Avenue. And at some point, they wanted to make that more modern looking. So in 1915, they laid brick on Central Avenue, and this is actually a picture of the bricklaying. And what they did was they put down dividers, spacing it out so that the brick could be laid, and they had guys working back there, carrying the bricks, putting it in the sand, leveling it out, and working down Central Avenue. But at the end of 1915, Marshfield Central Avenue Business District was all a brick building, a brick road. 1915 is also the year that the Yellowstone Trail became important to Marshfield, because that came through Marshfield and extended from the east coast to the west coast. So transportation was important to Marshfield. And while it's important to Marshfield, city streets kind of languished for years. People that grew up in Marshfield probably remember how crummy the streets could be, the side roads could be. And in the 1970s, the city councils thought we're going to start improving things, and they started putting in curb and gutter or blacktopping roads instead of having gravel roads. And it made a marked improvement in the appearance of the entire town. In 2001, they talked about a bypass around Marshfield for years, and finally they settled on a bypass going through town. They named it Veterans Parkway, and since 2001 it's gone through town, and people can kind of take a shortcut around Marshfield without using Central Avenue as the main thoroughfare. Number of cars down Central Avenue have dropped dramatically since that road was put in, and it's a much safer road. And then Marilyn Hardaker, who was the first woman to be elected mayor, fought for years to have a central Wisconsin corridor, the 2022 corridor, come in so that Marshfield had 4-lane access between Stevens Point and Marshfield. One of the things that the railroad did for us is that we had become kind of the hub of Wisconsin, the center of Wisconsin for transportation. When the railroad went away, we had less access to that. We were not as competitive. And by putting the 4-lane corridor in, it made or raised our competitiveness for attracting other businesses. So that was important. Now, this year marks Marshfield's 150th anniversary. We have a lot of things going on, but one that I wanted to talk about today, and that is recognizing Marshfield's 150 heroes and leaders. And the idea is to recognize people in Marshfield's past that have contributed to the well-being of the community. And some of those contributions are big and some of them are small. And a few months before, during 2021, I put together a list of these people as examples of people that might be nominated for this recognition. Some of them have been nominated already, some of them haven't. But I want to extend an invitation to anybody who happens to be listening to this. If you know somebody who is from Marshfield that should be recognized, it's very easy to go to the Marshfield Public Library. We have a drop-down bar on the navigation bar. There's a title for the 150th, and the first thing that comes up is identifying Marshfield's 150 Heroes and Leaders. And I would encourage everybody to write the stories. The idea was to collect some of the backstories for people who wouldn't typically be recognized. And we want the stories on people that everybody would talk about, but also for people that are everyday citizens that have made a difference. And so those nominations are encouraged. What started this was actually a story about a woman who went to school, became a Roman Catholic nun, and then during the Cold War was the first Roman Catholic nun to go behind the Iron Curtain and actually have a chance to go and visit the other sisters in the mother houses that they had stationed around Poland and things. So there's a story there to be told, and that was the idea of this. And so there's an invitation. Marshfield was the hub of Wisconsin back when the railroads came through. In many ways today, it is still the hub of Wisconsin. Instead of talking about the railroad access, though, we talk about medical care. Marshfield has reached out to lots of different communities to provide medical care. And so just as we were a hub then, we are still a hub today. And I think that Marshfield has a bright future because of the way it can work with other communities. I would invite you all to stop out in Marshfield if you get a chance. The Northwood County Historical Society is in the former Governor Upham House. We're open for tours Wednesdays and Saturdays from 1:30 to 4 or by appointments. We have a new heritage museum in the basement of our old library that goes through and talks about multiple different things that were important to Marshfield history. If you haven't been there, it's amazing what you can do in a small space. And those hours are also the same thing and by appointment. And then lastly, there's an exhibit at the Central Wisconsin, or not the Central Wisconsin Airport, the Marshfield Municipal Airport. That doesn't get seen very often. But Marshfield, Wausau, and a lot of the communities had a lot to do with the war effort during the 1950s, and this was put together called Wisconsin's Flying Trees, and it talks about the wood products industry and what they did toward the war effort in World War II, and it's worth visiting. There's lots of good stuff there. And with that, if anybody has questions, I'll try to answer them. Yeah?
That oldest park that you mentioned that you said is still there, what is the street address or what's?
Well, it would be on the corner of 2nd Street and 2nd Street and Central Avenue. The hotel?
No, the park. I thought she asked about the park.
Oh, okay, say it, what?
Yeah, the park that you mentioned.
Oh, Columbia Park, that's between Arnold and Chestnut Street. If you go up to the,
I know where Arnold is, and I kind of know.
you know where St. John's Church is?
There's something called Chestnut Arts.
Chestnut Arts is about 3 blocks the other direction. This is a block or 2 blocks north of the railroad tracks. Yeah,
Tracks are near Arnold Street.
you're right. Yes, Mr. Upham was governor, and again, these are those, there's just so many stories we can't talk about. He was elected governor in 1894, and he served from 1895 to 1897. One of the cool things about Mr. Upham, while he was governor, he signed legislation to create the State Historical Society. It was one of the things he put on his list of things to do when he went to the state legislature for the first, I don't know if it was a State of the Union or what, but it was one of the things he listed that we needed. Because up until that time, things were stored all over the place that were historically significant, and there was potential of them getting lost. So
was that in, where was the Capitol at the time? Was that
the Capitol is the same building. I can't say that for sure, but I think it's the same building at that time. The governor's mansion was a different house at that time. The governor's mansion was,
Oh, is that the mansion today?
no, the governor, Mr. Upham's house sometimes gets referred to as the Upham Mansion, but that's only because he was governor. It's just a big house. But down in Madison, the governor's mansion was different than the governor's mansion we have today. I think it's a private, yeah, I think it's a private house today.
What started that big fire that cleared out 12 blocks?
Okay, there's different stories about what started the fire. The fire probably was started by tinders from an engine in the Upham yard. They shook out the tinder box and the ash fell into the sawdust. It was a hot, dry summer day with a breeze, and it flared up. And once it flared up, it got out and it got into the log piles and the lumber piles, and they couldn't get it out. So it could have been, they usually blame a passing Wisconsin Central Railroad, but it could just as well have been one of the engines that Upham used in his plant to switch and move cars around. Nobody really knows what exactly that is. Yeah, he was actually the biggest loser. Everything except his house went that day. It was $900,000 worth of damage that he sustained himself.
What's the population of Marshfield today?
About 18,000.
The two sons from his second marriage, did they stay in the Marshfield area?
No, Fritz moved, both of them went into service, got married. Bill lived in Milwaukee, and Fritz lived out in Colorado near Denver. Actually, the Upham family, the kids are coming back to Marshfield. Our June Dairy Day celebration is the 4th of June, and his granddaughter is going to be the parade marshal. And the other kids from Fritz's side of the family are coming home for a family reunion in July, and they'll be visiting us then.
So they didn't keep their roots in the Marshfield area?
No, everybody has a different, they grow up and they go out in their own path. Bill went into insurance, and I can't remember what Fritz did, but he ended up out west. Anybody else?
Isn't there a house that's open for tours?
Right, that would be the Upham house. The Upham house, the second Mrs. Upham lived in that house until 1975, and when she passed away, the family offered it to the Historical Society. We actually purchased it from them, and it's been the home of the Northwood County Historical Society since 1975.
Is that, I know there's an Upham Street there on the north side.
Right, after Mr. Upham died, there was actually a couple of different moves. One was to create, to change the name of Central Avenue from Central Avenue to Upham Avenue. And then they also talked about changing the name of the town from Marshfield to Uptonville, I think it was, but that didn't go anywhere. But Mr. Upham was very well thought of, and everybody was thinking of different things they could do to recognize or honor him.
Today there's a street named for him, is there anything else?
Not that I know of as far as specifically named for him. When you think about Marshfield, we have the Wildwood Park and Zoo that he sold to the city in 1904 for the Marshfield Electric Plant, and it included all of what today is Wildwood Park. Where the Marshfield ball diamonds are on Oak Street is all the old lumber yard, and this year there's a move to create some connectors between Central Avenue and the recreational area, some redevelopment plans that are in the works. But that would be all an area that he owned at one time. So there's lots of things that we use yet every day, but we don't tend to think about him when we do it. The Central Wisconsin State Fair, he also owned, purchased it. It was one of the investors to start with when the Depression of the 1890s hit in 1893. He ended up buying that and saving it. He was offered $13,000 for it a couple times and kept it and sold it to the city for $1,000 sometime.
I didn't say anything about the zoo.
Oh,
How did that get started there?
oh, that's another story for another day. So,
The zoo with the Kodiak bear.
yes, okay, you've been to Marshfield to see the Kodiak bears. We've got some great stuff at the zoo, so.
Do you have any
Did the
information?
railroad have a roundhouse?
So, yes, we had 2 roundhouses
I
in.
remember going when I was going down there and watched the trains circle around.
Okay, we had one that, if you know where Hiller's Hardware is now on Central Avenue,
Way down on the south end.
that was down between 8th Street and 7th Street, set back towards Cedar is where the roundhouse was for the Chicago Northwestern. Then there was another there was another turntable,
Where that Japanese restaurant is today, was that a roundhouse?
Japanese restaurant.
Relative
Royal Tokyo is the old depot moved across the street. There was a roundhouse, not a roundhouse, but a turntable down just past the intersection of that street with, or First Street with Vine Avenue. So there were a couple turntables, there was only one roundhouse that I know of. Okay? Thank you for coming. And it-
Marshfield, the round barn that's at the fairgrounds, is the widest or the largest?
it's, no one has ever challenged the claim to being the largest round barn in the United States.
Well, I just read something, because I belong to one of these Facebook groups, they said the Marshfield one is really the biggest on the bottom, but on the top, there's a second level, or it's like tiered, whereas there is one, I don't know if it's Nebraska or Kansas, that's not as wide on the bottom, but it's wide all the top. So,
We're very proud. That is basically an icon for the city. If you see the round barn in something, you know they're talking about Marshfield, so.
Is there a well-known restaurant in the downtown area?
That's historically,
they still have a Perkins.
Oh,
yeah. You were talking a historic hotel or a,
a restaurant that's been around for a long time or anything?
the Royal Tokyo is probably the place that would come to mind as far as having a historic theme. The Lumberyard restaurant on the north side of town has a nice theme connected to history, but as far as being long-lived historical restaurant, at this point I'd say no. They try to incorporate history into the themes of restaurants, but as far as any of the existing hotels or existing restaurants having a long past connection, I can't say off the top of my head. So, okay? Thank you all for coming.